This is really hot off the press and just got finished and sent to me yesterday. And so some of it, as I said, I've presented on a number of times some of the preliminary findings, and these are, like I said, about 95% complete. So there have been some updates, and now what I'm excited to share, there's some projections about what we anticipate our building stock to look like in 2050 and how we're being mindful of that when we're thinking about what policies and programs we should be thinking about now. Okay, so this is just the disclaimer. I will say I'm not sure how readily we can publicly share everything, but I know I'll get the slides out for people with the information, the data, because we tend to share that a lot and want to be transparent and make that available to everyone. Okay, so the building stock baseline assessment. All right, and so this is looking at our building stock across the entire city of Grand Rapids by square footage, okay? So if we look at the pie chart, we have three categories. Single family homes make up 51% of all the square footage in the city of Grand Rapids, okay? Number two is commercial, that's 32%. And then we've pulled out, we consider multifamily as a part of commercial, but we've pulled out here for purposes of showing the data, multifamily makes up 17%. And multifamily is 5 units or more, and how that is divvied up. So you can see at the bottom, we have just over 225 million square feet of buildings in the city of Grand Rapids, and just over 66,000 buildings. The bar chart on the right breaks down those building types by size. So the first bar is from 0 to 20,000 square feet. And then you get progressively bigger, 20 to 50, all the way over to greater than 200,000 square feet. So the bulk of all of our buildings, probably at least 80%, are less than 20,000 square feet. So that's important to think about when you think about policies. Some places have looked at and said, well, we're just going to focus on big buildings. So maybe this policy or this program only applies to a building that's greater than 20,000 square feet. Well, we just need to be really mindful of who is that lopping off, and is that the intention that we want. Now, this gets into a little bit more detail, but it just breaks down, and you'll see the word exempt used. So that's tax exempt. So those are nonprofit partners, governmental agencies, faith-based organizations, academic institutions. And so when we collected the data, the way we started was with our city assessor's office. We started with square footage for properties across the city. We don't collect square footage for tax exempt properties. And so we did some estimation around that, although I worked with a lot of key partners and even some folks who are here today to really try to collect as much of that as we can from, Grand Valley and Kendall and Spectrum Health and some of the big heavy hitters in the cities to get actual square footage for those properties. But this also, I think it's interesting because it does happen to show and break out. If you look in multifamily, you can look at, it's showing that 15% is taxable, and, just 0.11% is what we have under nonprofit status. And you can look at that for commercial as well, and it shows, it even pulls out commercial exempt for city-owned properties. So we have a pretty small sliver, but be mindful, it doesn't include industrial property. So this doesn't include, for instance, our wastewater treatment plant. So again, breaking down a little bit more detail, the types of buildings that we have in the city of Grand Rapids based on square footage alone. Single family, again, being 51%, multifamily being shown here, and then really breaking down commercial to show which buildings do we have the most. So warehouse, unrefrigerated warehouse space, office, college, K through 12, retail, hospital. You can see, right? Those are the ones that we have the most square footage. And then sometimes you might want to look from a policy perspective and say, let's focus on those buildings that are the biggest, right? I'm not going to go through all of this detail, but I did just want to keep it here because it's a number of notes, and we worked really hard to identify any assumptions or methodology that we used. And I already talked about our assessor data and how we worked on estimating for the tax exempt properties. Okay, so now we're transitioning. That was based on square footage data, and then we worked with Architecture 2030 and other partners to come up with an estimate around energy consumption for these buildings based on building type, based on our weather patterns, based on EPA regional breakdowns of natural gas versus electricity consumption for different types of buildings. And this is based on the same data and calculations used for the 2030 program, which is a 2003 CBEX baseline. Right? So that's how these calculations are created. So most times, the bigger your building, the more energy you consume. Smaller building, less, right? There are some anomalies which we'll point out, but for the most part, you'll see that this lines up fairly closely with square footage, except for, right, single family, you'll see ultimately only makes up 40% of total energy consumption. It was 51% square footage, right? Homes tend to operate more efficiently than commercial buildings, right? Commercial buildings are bigger and tend to be more energy intensive. So while I think it was 37% of total square footage is dedicated to commercial buildings, they account for 46% of energy being consumed. Okay, so similar type of breakdown, except, oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to highlight the graph in the bottom right with the orange and the green. So this is looking at energy consumption by fuel type, electricity versus natural gas. No surprise to those of you in the building industry, you know, right here in Grand Rapids, we're cold, winter dominated, and so we have a higher use of natural gas than we do of electricity. This is very different from some of our partners that are in California, right? They're almost predominantly all electricity, very little natural gas, and that impacts what your carbon footprint is associated with the different types of fuels that you were using. So on average, even though there's a little bit of variation between single family, multifamily, and commercial, we're right around 60 to 65% of all of the energy being consumed by our buildings is natural gas, okay? And then the remaining 35 to 40% is electricity. So this graph, again, in line, the orange is showing natural gas consumption by building type versus electricity consumption. So single family, multifamily, and then again, you can see the top 5 to 7 are about the same as those that are the largest by square footage. So college, office, hospital, warehouse moved down a little bit, but K through 12 and retail. And there aren't very many that are more electricity dominant. They're predominantly all natural gas dominant. So then this is in line with the 2030 district, right? Because the way that we look at performance is EUI, energy use intensity, right? So that's taking all of your energy being consumed, electricity and natural gas, and you're dividing it by your square footage of your building. So this allows you via one metric to compare one building to another building, whether it's a hospital, school, home, you know, different types of buildings, and regardless of your size. It normalizes for building type as well as building size. And so you start to look at it, and on the left, these are our most energy intensive building types. Fast food restaurants are off the chart, right? They are the most energy intensive building type that we have. And then supermarket number 2, hospital 3, restaurant 4, and convenience store 5. This is where the picture really starts to change based on just big square foot and big energy consumption versus what's your most energy intensive building types. Hospital's really the only one that is the same in the top 5. But I used to work in the food industry, and I can attest to and know because of their operations how energy intensive supermarkets and convenience stores are. And so again, all things to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about policies and programs. Are there certain programs that we should cater to the food industry because they are such energy intensive building types? And keeping that in mind. So the top number here is an average EUI for that building type. It could change based on if you have a building type in the community, so you should work through to vet it, but this will give you an average to understand what your baseline is, okay? And the number in white shown on the bar charts would be a 50% reduction, and that's the goal in line with the 2030 district. Now that's a community-wide goal, right? So kind of normalizing across the entire community, but this will help people understand if, hopefully, we will incentivize and encourage you to sign up for the 2030 district and work with your clients and customers to do so. But this is really one of the first times that we've had that information that we can share with you, so that if you want to sign up, you could say, well, what does that really mean? Okay, I'm a hospital. That means that I need to, if I really wanted to try to work hard to meet the goal, get to 118 EUI. And then I can go back and I can look at my 2017 data and I can actually calculate my EUI based on my own metrics, my own energy consumption, and I can see how I can compare to that 118 and what I might need to do to get there. So you can start to better understand what that process would look like. This is the same information just shown in alphabetical order by building type, so that if you wanted to look for your building, you could more easily find it here. Okay, and so the methodology here, I just wanted to point out, they are using the zero tool to estimate the EUI baseline, and they use the EPA regional fuel split to determine that mix of natural gas and electricity. Okay, so now we're looking at energy consumption. So this graph, we talked about the electricity versus the gas. If you look on the top right, this is looking at consumers' energy and what is the fuel mix for consumers' energy. Right, so when we buy electricity, where does that electricity come from? Okay, 35% of it comes from natural gas, 34% comes from coal, 22% comes from nuclear, and then you have a variety of others, but right now about 10% renewable, because that was via the Renewable Portfolio Standard mandate that they have to have 10% renewables. Okay, so that's the top, is just looking at the fuel mix. When you transition to the bottom of this slide, that's converting your fuel mix into your greenhouse gas emissions footprint associated with this fuel mix. So you can see all of a sudden the electricity is quite large, right? That's because right now our fuel mix is natural gas and coal, right? Those are dirtier forms of fuel than renewable, hydro, nuclear, which don't have carbon emissions associated with them. So the carbon intensity of electricity is greater right now for us here in Grand Rapids than the carbon intensity of natural gas. Right? So if your number one goal is to reduce your carbon footprint, then you would focus on electricity right now, because you'll make greater strides in reducing your carbon footprint by reducing your electricity. Okay, and then on the bottom right, that just shows the carbon emissions associated with the fuel mix. So natural gas and coal, and then you can see the others, right? And nuclear is not up there because there isn't a carbon footprint associated with nuclear. Now, just note, this is today, right? Consumers Energy has made a commitment in their integrated resource plan, which they've submitted to the Public Service Commission, to get to 40% renewables by 2040. And they're looking to retire all of their coal plants, right? So this dynamic is going to change a lot based on what Consumers Energy is doing. So we can all be taking that into consideration, and that's going to help us, but that's not going to get us to zero net carbon. There's still quite a bit of work that has to be done beyond that. So I talked about this being Consumers Energy's electricity grid mix. Okay, so now similarly, but now we're talking about the carbon emissions of our building stock. And so single family home, 37, commercial, 49, multifamily, 14%. I can tell you city operations is less than 1%, okay? Now that's not including our industrial processes, but for purposes of looking through the lens of the Zero Cities project, and all building types except for industrial, we're less than 1%. So we can do, and we want to be a leader, right? We want to set the example, we want to show what we can do, but we're less than 1%, right? This is a community initiative, and this is why we need to be engaging everyone throughout the community to help move the entire city of Grand Rapids towards zero net carbon. And so this just shows you the emissions breakdown. I won't go through everything, it's fairly similar around that, just taking into consideration our fuel mix. And so on the bottom right, you can see electricity is much higher because that has the dirtier fuel mix associated with it. And then this is showing similarly the breakdown by building type. Okay, so now we're going to transition. Oh, I had two more before to get in there. So this is one of the early findings to be mindful of. So this green sliver, 1.8%, are buildings that are over 10,000 square feet in the city of Grand Rapids. They make up less than 2% of all the square footage, but they make up 42% of the community's greenhouse gas emissions, right? This is good to know, right? We probably need to be focusing on buildings that are greater than 10,000 square feet to make movement on this goal. So this is good information that is the result of this analysis. So now I just want to share a little bit with you about some projections, right? Because that was kind of current state. But the key goal of this project is to say by 2050, we would love to get as close to zero net carbon as we can. And so we need to understand what's going to change in our community and what's going to change around the built environment between now and 2050 to take that into consideration as well. So population growth. Right now, some of the data that we've been looking at shows we're just shy of 200,000 people for City of Grand Rapids. Okay, and the metropolitan statistical area is very different. That's pulling in kind of suburbs and a much greater area, which gets us, I think, closer to 750,000. But if you look at city of Grand Rapids alone, we're just shy of 200,000 people. By 2040, the projections are that we'll grow about 40,000 extra people in the city of Grand Rapids, right? They need somewhere to live. You know, are we going to have more businesses? Are they going to work? You know, all of that ties into this. So we need to be mindful of population growth. Okay, so now this is looking at building area trends. Okay, so on the gray on the bottom shows of our building stock, and along the line is the timeline. So 2017, right? This point in time, we're saying everything is an existing building. But moving forward into the future, into 2050, this shows the projections around how much square footage we will have that will be new buildings, new construction. And then within the existing buildings, how many of those are projected to have renovations? And this is based a lot on, I work a lot with Lou Canfield here in the development center and looking at trends going on around construction and permits and renovations and demolition, et cetera, to take this all into consideration. And then you can see a sales line, right? Because one key area where you can have policies are at point of sale, right? What do you include at point of sale? And so you'll have homes that could be sold multiple times between now and 2050, hence why a sales line is higher. And then on the right, it's broken down. And you can see really new buildings, we don't really have the capacity or the area to have a lot more single-family homes built in the city of Grand Rapids. Residential is predominantly multifamily construction that's taking place, as well as some commercial that's taking place as well. And this goes through and just helps to identify that. And the assumption here that we call out is that growth in residential will be almost all multifamily by 2050. Okay, so then looking at energy trends with respect to this building growth. Okay, so even in 2050, right, I don't know what the total percentage is there, but I'm going to say it's at least 75%, maybe a smidge more, of the energy consumed is still going to be by existing buildings. Right? So there's certain things you can do with new buildings, and new buildings coming on have to meet the energy code, right? And so there should be more energy efficient than our existing building. But right, you're thinking about different policy options around new buildings versus existing buildings and where that's going to take place and the energy consumption associated with existing versus new construction. Okay. Now, interesting, I just wanted to share this because I've had just a couple conversations with a few people, but the assumption here is that new buildings are meeting the current code. I've had some people share some concerns that that may not actually be the case, right? And so we need to be mindful about that and think about that. A number of the other cities, most of them participating in Zero Cities, their local city has their own energy code, right? Here in Michigan, we have a statewide energy code. So we don't have the ability to be more stringent in certain circumstances beyond what state code requires. And so that's just kind of something we have to take into consideration while we're working through this project. And this also says that there's no change in fuel split over time for existing or new buildings. That means in 2050, right now we're still saying that split of about 60 to 65% natural gas is still going to exist. And there's a question around that, right? There's a lot of talk around electrification, right? And if that happens, your fuel split moves higher into electricity and less into natural gas, right? Places like California are already doing things to kind of mandate that and to get there. And you might say, well, why are they doing that? Because they have the ability to push and ensure that their electricity is fueled by renewable sources, right? So if you can get to a point where your building is 90% electricity, right? They don't have winter, they're not using big boilers to heat everything. So it's mostly just kind of your hot water, right? And some other cooking, perhaps. So if you can move to get to almost all electricity, and then your utility transitions their fuel mix to all renewable, right? Then you've made significant progress toward getting to zero carbon, right? So that's a big question mark that we'll have to be thinking about. And as technologies improve, and how well do those technologies work in a cold weather climate? Okay, so this is fairly similar. This is taking the energy consumption again and turning it into greenhouse gas emissions. So again, the bulk of it, 75 to 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions are going to be focused in our existing buildings. And you can see the growth on the right for how that's predicted to change between multifamily and commercial is a little off, but with new construction and existing. Okay. So this is my last slide on Zero Cities, and then I think I was just going to share two more things, and I'll open it up for questions. So I'm just going to touch on a few of these because this is still very new, but this is kind of a summary of everything that we've taken into consideration in the results of the Zero Cities project, right? We have a lot of single-family homes. It makes up a good portion of our square footage, right? But it's a smaller amount of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's an important component that we need to be focused on, but it's a lot harder to move a lot of individuals, right, than to move a smaller population of people focused on commercial buildings. But something to be mindful of, right? We talked about electricity right now is only 36% of our energy makeup, but 70% of our emissions, right? So we have to be mindful of that. And it's good that our utility is making some commitments and moving, so what's that gonna mean for us? But what else are we doing? We talked about how many, just shy of 2% of our buildings are greater than 10,000 square feet, but they account for 42%, right? So right now you can say, buildings greater than 10,000 square feet, 42% of all emissions. Single-family homes, 37% of emissions. Those two together make up almost all of the emissions, right? So when we start to think about different areas. Let's see what a couple of other things that we're going to look at. Talked about, the number of buildings that are existing buildings that are going to continue and that there will be some new construction growth. So there are some different mechanisms that we can look at and think about for purposes of that. One over here on the top right, energy efficiency upgrades for single-family residentials have a potential to have significant decrease in emissions. I think that's really important. I mean, you really can't get to zero net carbon if we're not talking about all of us in our individual homes. And so that's something that is really important to me, and I think particularly when we layer on the equity measures and metrics. Right now, I've been talking about it a little bit, but I would like to see some programs and a focus around helping to reduce the energy burden on low-income households in the city of Grand Rapids, right? We have a big conversation going on nationally, and Grand Rapids isn't any different around affordability and housing. Well, if your utility bills are making up a huge chunk of your monthly bills, that's a problem, right? And we need to be working on finding solutions to help reducing that energy burden to help people stay in their homes, right? There are lots of benefits to it. There's the financial savings for the individuals, keeping people in their homes, neighborhood stabilization, of course, all of the environmental benefits that come along with it. So for me, I am very passionate and want to be focused on that area as a core segment to start looking at and thinking about. We talked about point of renovation policies and point of sale policies, right? If somebody's gonna come in and you wanna do a major renovation to your building, what's the carrot and stick approach that we can have around what type of renovations, are available and need to be installed in that building to help with this goal, as well as point of sale, right? And some things, and I know Sherry and I have been having conversations, and there are other communities, right, that have energy disclosure requirements or energy benchmarking. So if you want to sell your home or your building, you actually have to talk about how much did your utility bills cost, right? It's one story, particularly in a home, if you're looking at here's how much my rent will be. Well, if your utility bill is going to be, half of that, that's a big part of the story that currently isn't required, and there are other communities that are looking at requiring that, even for commercial buildings, right? If you're trying to look at selling your building and taking that into consideration. So I'm just going to finish with two other updates on the main energy discussion, because I also am a firm believer that the city needs to be an example, and I don't want to stand up here and talk about what our community needs to do if we as a city aren't doing it. And so we are working on a number of initiatives where we're trying to drive this. So right now we own, of our facilities that we own, in 2017, we consumed 87.8 million kilowatt hours. Okay, a number of our facilities, like our Lake Michigan filtration plant, our main water utility is located out on the lakeshore. It's not within the city of Grand Rapids, right? And we also serve about 35 to 40% of the service that comes from both our water and our wastewater utilities service customer communities, right? The communities adjacent to the city of Grand Rapids, right? And so we're looking at trying to meet our goal of 100% renewable energy by 2025 with respect to city-owned facilities, right? We can't force our customer communities to adopt the same goals. We want to work with them and collaborate with them. But so what we've done is we've taken and created our renewable energy baseline, and that's actual energy consumed within the city of Grand Rapids by City of Grand Rapids buildings and residents. So our baseline for purposes of renewable energy is 62.8 million kilowatt hours. So currently we're at 34% in terms of getting toward our goal, which is just over 21 million kilowatt hours, predominantly via green generation contract where we're purchasing RECs through Consumers Energy. We also, and everyone can account for and take into consideration that the electricity you get from consumers, if they're your utility provider, right, 10% of that comes from renewable. So we're taking that into consideration. And we have a very small solar array on our Oak Industrial facility. So right now, we have an energy advisory committee, and we just met yesterday and are getting much closer to hopefully announcing a firmed up strategy to move us toward 100% with a focus around solar. And we'll be looking at places like our Lake Michigan filtration plant, some opportunities on rooftops, or we found we have 9 parking lots greater than 100,000 square feet. So I just learned that. And so we're going to be, hopefully my goal is before mid next year to have some RFPs out around some solar development. We get a lot of questions about Butterworth. That's a very important component of this conversation. There are a lot of complexities around Butterworth in terms of it being a landfill. And we used to, previously when we did an RFP, if you're familiar with it, it fell through, the company went bankrupt. But our wastewater treatment plant, known as our Water Resource Recovery Facility, was going to be the off-taker for solar generated electricity. With their very innovative biodigester project that they have going on, they don't need any additional energy source. So we're still working through trying to identify our options for generation and off-takers at Butterworth. But that's an important part of the conversation as well. And then lastly, I did just want to, how many people are members of the 2030 district? Okay. How many people are not very familiar with the 2030 district? Okay. So I'm going to share 3 slides with you, and Sherry is your woman, so get with her after this if you want. But this is really important to us and really ties very nicely to the Zero Cities Project, right? The Zero Cities Project ultimately wants to result in some projects and policies to move us toward extreme energy efficiency, renewable energy, and carbon emission reduction, right? But we need actual data, right? And that's where the 2030 district comes into play. We all need better data to understand what is happening here in our community with our building stock. And so the 2030 district, it's a voluntary program, it's free, it's a public-private partnership. USGBC is the one that manages it. We were the 11th district to be created. There are now 20. And we were the first last December that we decided to expand. Most cities started and just focused on their urban core. And particularly in alignment with our Zero Cities project, we said, no, let's make it our full city. So we were the first city to really expand our 2030 district to be inclusive of our entire city. And this is for commercial, nonprofit, multifamily, industrial, governmental, faith-based. The only thing it doesn't include is single-family homes, okay? And so you really, when you sign up, you're making a commitment to share your data around electricity and natural gas consumption or other forms of energy consumption via Energy Star. And that really helps us to better understand what is happening here within the city of Grand Rapids. And they really provide a lot of great resources if you're not familiar with that, about how to work through that. They have a small business assistance program to help small businesses looking at energy efficiency as well. Currently, there are over 14 million square feet. The city has 138 properties that are included, and we account for 3.3 million square feet of that. And here are some examples of some of the buildings that are currently participating in the 2030 district.